Welcome to the Leicester Center for Entrepreneurship, Entrepreneurs Forum. I am Andre Marquis. I am the Executive Director of the Leicester Center. You are in for quite a treat this evening with the other F word. So these gentlemen have been longtime entrepreneurs and longtime lecturers here at the Haas School of Business. They distilled everything about leadership through failure, can I use that phrase? Leadership through failure? Into a weekend, one of our highest rated classes ever, and out of that incredible weekend they put together for the students, they have elaborated that into a book.
A weekend became a book.
A weekend became a book. And it is an incredibly important topic. I'm really looking forward to hear from them. A couple things about the Leicester Center. Of course, if you are here, you know about our website, entrepreneurship.berkeley.edu. We have a whole bunch of exciting events coming in the spring. We have our best practices series for entrepreneurs. We have our global social venture competition. We have our new launch competition that's also an accelerator, and numerous other, yeah, we got some entrants. It's an accelerator. What are you doing here? You should be working on your startup. They have special dispensation. But I could not be more excited about this evening. Come to our other events, but most of all, learn from Mark Coopersmith and John Danner this evening. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about a really important topic tonight. We're here to talk about something that we call the other F word. And we call it the other F word because it's one of those topics that people, well, he doesn't know that that one doesn't work. This is the one that works. At least we're going to have some fun tonight. Does this one work?
That should work.
It does. So it's one of these topics, the other F word, failure, that people think about a lot, but they don't really like to talk about a lot. So why is that? Why is it that failure is such a difficult topic for us to talk about? Well, one of the key things is, of course, we have this incredible impediment in our mind. We're afraid of failure. So at the very beginning, at the very start of this talk, we'll talk about the issue that the potential to fail is one of these things that we fear. And because we fear it, we don't like to talk about it. And because we don't talk about it, it gets in the way of all of these other elements that we can empower, because failure has the potential to unlock these things that we as entrepreneurs and executives think are so important. And the three areas that John and I have focused on in this work that we've done are innovation, growth, and employee engagement. Because if you think about it, those are those key elements that as entrepreneurs we're really striving to get going, to get our businesses going. Now, failure is one of these things that's all around us. There's a rainbow of failure. Let me, well, John, help me if I get these numbers wrong. So let's take a look at how often failure happens. 51% are the number of shots that Michael Jordan missed throughout his career. 50 to 70% is the percentage of companies that fail within the first, what do we think? 12 to 18 months of their existence. 68%, big IT projects. We know how much we all love new technology on the big IT front, right? 68% of big IT projects fail. They fail to meet their objectives. 75% of venture-backed companies don't even return the capital that their venture investors put in them. And these are the creme de la creme, supposedly the most vetted entrepreneurs. 81%. How many of you did made New Year's resolutions this year? How are those working for you? 81% of New Year's resolutions fail to be met. 95% of new product introductions fail to meet their projections or fail altogether. And you know how we talk about intellectual property protection, barriers to entry, patents, and how important those are? 99.9% of patents actually are never commercialized. You don't make a dime off them. So failure is all around us. John?
One of the interesting things about this other F word is that not only is it universal, but everybody in this audience, everybody around the world is an expert in it. Because we all do it every day in about every way. And it's not surprising given the universality, some would say even the inevitability of failure, that a lot of people have thought about it and a lot of people have written about it, including Scott Adams most recently, who's a distinguished alumnus. For those of you that don't know, the creator of Dilbert is also a contributor to the failure lexicon, the failure literature. So is the Harvard Business Review, so are a number of very prominent authors and wise folks from around the world. So amidst all of that, what is it that we thought we might be able to bring to this discussion about the other F word? And as Mark and I reviewed the literature, the available research, when we talked to people around the world in various kinds of positions, everybody from the chairman of the board of Royal Dutch Shell, Randy Komisar, very powerful CEOs from Fortune 100 companies, nonprofits, government officials, the governor of Michigan, astronauts, the guy that has the world record for the most space shuttle. I mean, we went all over to try to understand what this phenomenon.
Well, what are some other, I mean, we talked to a lot of people. We talked to the former CEO of Charles Schwab. We talked to, you mentioned governors. We had Guy Kawasaki, who was here a little while back, sharing with us things like if you take risks, and if you want to innovate, you're going to take risks. If you take risks, you will sometimes fail. So, some of the other folks we talked to.
And Mark Hoplemasian, who's the CEO of Hyatt Hotels, spent time with us talking about what he's trying to do in a very large company to re-inject a spirit of innovation. And how, to use Mark's phrase, version 0.5 beats version 1.0, by which he means he'd rather have people try an imperfect solution rather than wait until they try to get it perfect and it never gets done. So we had this rich tapestry of experiences and perspectives about failure. But as we looked through this literature, we thought that there was something missing. Yes, there were wonderful, inspiring personal memoirs, the kind of story that you sort of read and you say, hurrah, that is great. This person struggled, he or she persevered, and they produced great, fabulous success at the end. That's wonderful, very inspiring. The difficulty is that it's inspiring but hard to apply sometimes when it comes to our day-to-day jobs and the reality of the challenges that we face in complicated organizations, including startups. Second category was what we would call kind of the Silicon Valley rah-rah, right? The cheerleading, fail often, fail fast. We've all heard that, and we figured everybody's heard that. That doesn't really add much. It's lovely to kind of exhort people to embrace failure, to try to do something that makes failure almost a fetish unto itself. And we said, no, we're not really interested in helping people celebrate failure. We don't want them to wallow in it. It's hard enough to swallow it, frankly. But we did want people to kind of liberate it, if you will, to make it a topic of legitimate focus and concern for managers and executives in various kinds of organizations. And the last category that we stumbled upon was what we would call the blah blah category. And yes, the world is filled with self-help publications about your personal attitudes about failure and how you come to terms with yourself and those things. They can be great for personal discovery, but again, struggle a little bit when it comes to applying it in the workplace. So we figured maybe there's an opportunity to contribute something that helps people figure out what to do with failure. It's inevitable, we're all experts in creating it, but what do you do as a leader, as a team member, as an entrepreneur, as an executive, to actually, as we put it to work? So when we thought about that, we went to our publishers and they loved this idea. John Wiley, we're going to be a lead title coming out next month when the book is published. And they said, you know, let us give you some ideas about covers. And this was one of their ideas. They love this idea. I assume you can guess what the person's saying there, right? But they love this idea. Let's take the other F word literally, can we? And just drive it home. And we said, well, you know, that's kind of interesting, but we'd like something a little bit more subdued, you know, that still gets a taboo nature of it. But this expresses what a lot of people, what most of us feel when we encounter failure. We look at it as an incredibly unfortunate regret. What we hope to do in this book, and maybe give you some ideas this evening, is how to turn failure from an unfortunate regret into a strategic resource. And that's what we're going to be spending most of our time on. So Mark mentioned that the difficulty, one of the many difficulties we have with this topic, is that we think a lot about it. We're very afraid of it. We remember failures very, very intensely. And we sometimes anticipate failures. We're kind of caught in this distorted funhouse mirror hall where the fear exaggerates the anticipation, the memory exaggerates the likelihood of failure, and perhaps even the consequences of that failure. But if you can't talk about it, you can't really manage it. You can't leverage it. So guess what? You wouldn't have invited two teachers here if you didn't expect some homework. In this case, some seat work. So here's the deal. First question. How many people here have experienced a failure in a product, a project, a class, a business, an investment? How many people have experienced a failure in, let me just see. I just want to see if we have any superhumans here. Looks like we've got pretty much a full house of everybody that's had, and ours too, right? Yeah. We had, basically in one of the classes that Mark and I teach, we have to lead with our resume, all those things that you don't really put on your real resume, because we figured we had to be honest about this if we were going to have any credibility at all. All right, now comes the homework part. Spend 30 seconds, starting now, thinking about a failure that you've experienced. A professional failure. We're not interested in failed love affairs or those kinds of things, failure as a parent or failure as a child. But think about a professional, a business failure that you've experienced. Just think about one. And think about the lesson that that failure taught you, okay? And you've already wasted 10 seconds. So think about one, have it in your mind. Can we give them an extension for 10 seconds?
10 more seconds.
All right, 10 more seconds. Everybody got one? Now comes the social hour. Introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you and spend 30 seconds. One of you tell that person what your failure was, and then we'll call time and you can flip roles, okay?
And
so introduce yourself first.
Actually, let's what it was and what you walked away with it from.
What
was your insight? What was your learning?
What's the failure and what's the lesson? So introduce yourself to the person sitting next to you, or if you need to reach out and find somebody, go ahead and do that. Introduce yourselves.
That's good. Good.
You're next.
Whatever you want.
What do you think about now? We want to cut it short. Let's see. Yeah. All right, change roles. Thank Thank you, thank you.
So how was the unresume? Was it good? Was it meaty stuff? Was there good things? Were there some great insights that came out of this? For those of you that were sharing your insights, were you able to share some of those insights and learnings and maybe apply them later on? Hopefully you did. And if you didn't, the rest of this talk is going to be particularly valuable, because that's really what we're trying to get at. So, everybody has issues of failure. Everybody fails. And the key thing is what we take away from it. Now, this is the fun part. When you have a talk that's entitled The Other F Word, everybody knows what one of the F words is, and then they wonder what the other F word is. So we're going to get into that in just a second. So we've all failed at various times. And this particular word, snafu, came out of World War II. And it was the infantry in the army. Whenever the army did something to them and they found themselves in this terrible situation, they said, yep, we've got another snafu. Situation normal, all fucked up. And as we started thinking about this topic, the other F word, we said it's okay to be a little profane at times. So we said, what kinds of failure are there? We have the fuck-ups, which are things you bring upon yourself. And we will be talking about some of those. There's some knowing laughs there, right? We bring some of these failures upon ourselves. And then there's the other type of failure. The shit happens. And a lot of times, and we say, well, sometimes there really is shit happens. Sometimes there's a disaster. Sometimes a plane flies into the World Trade Center. There's a hurricane, there's a storm. Sometimes there are those acts of God where it really does happen. But more often than not, when you lay that off on the shit happens category, there are things that you could have or should have seen coming that you didn't, or you didn't prepare for, or you didn't respond in the right way. And those are the failures that then happen to you that you had opportunities to handle in a fundamentally different way. And that was really the essence that came through in so many of the interviews and the research that we did. And that really caused us to say, what's our definition of failure? And our definition of failure, so we felt we really needed to put a specific definition in place, and that's mistakes and unwelcome outcomes that matter. And we say matter, and that's somewhat subjective, because what matters to me might not matter to Nancy, and vice versa. Nancy, my classmate, Haas MBA, class of 1986. Go Bears. So it's great to have you here. So the definition is subjective, and that's really important, because take a look, for example, at the bronze medal winner at the Olympics. Some of the bronze medal winners are incredibly elated and ecstatic to be there, and others look like the world just fell out from underneath them. Why? Because of what their expectations were. So that's where we looked at this and we said, no, failure is a subjective matter. It's unwelcome outcomes that matter. And why do they matter? Why does failure matter? Let's go back to some of those things at the very beginning. It matters because it impacts innovation. It matters because it impacts growth, and it can impact it positively. And it matters because of the way that it affects the culture of companies. It's the way your employees engage with their hearts as well as their minds.
So we looked at this topic across basically all phases of business and organizational life. We started with startups, appropriately enough. And startups, face a particular daunting gauntlet of failures. I mean, if you think about startups, startups are marvelous little failure machines. They create failure all the time. That's the nature of the beast. About 7 million new businesses get started in the United States every year. You know how many go out of business about every year? About 7 million. about 7 million. Now, they go out of business for lots of different reasons. Some people retire, some people sell, some people just get tired of doing it. But more or less, you're talking about a fairly hefty amount of activity coming and going, dealing with failure all the time in all kinds of ways. It's sort of the nature of a startup. And any of you who have been in a startup or have tried to start a startup, you know what I mean. You're creating more failure more often than a lot of other folks that have not had that experience yet. That's part of your badge of honor. Now, we also went and looked at a set of companies that we ended up calling keep-ups. Now, these are the small and medium enterprises of the world. Over 90% of the registered businesses in the world fall into this category. These are folks that basically are the mainstream of business, both in the US and around the world. What's their issue with failure? Well, think about those challenges that Mark talked about: innovation, growth, employee engagement. These people have already surpassed the challenges of being a startup, but they face the challenge of revitalizing themselves, of keeping up with competition, of growing, of getting scale. And they deal with failure in a different manifestation. They deal with it in a different complexion than startups. They have some reserves that startups don't have. They have some ability to perhaps forgive more kinds of failure than startups do, but they're facing their own gauntlet. And that takes us to grown-ups, these huge companies. Huge companies, the companies like the Fortune 500. Fortune 500 generates in revenues the equivalent of about 2/3 of the American economy, right? About $12 trillion versus $17 trillion, something in those kinds of ranges. What's the issue that failure poses for these folks? Having talked to a lot of both chairmen of the board, CEOs, senior executives in these organizations, one of the things that Mark and I came to the conclusion of is the biggest issue for these folks is trust. Because if you cannot capture trust in an organization, your ability to get the most out of your employees, the ability to get alignment, the ability to get creativity, the ability to embrace innovation is dramatically constrained. So we looked at all three categories: startups, keep-ups, and grown-ups, in order to try to see if there were patterns of how different kinds of organizations failed and how those that survived and maybe even thrived in the face of failure, what the patterns were that allowed those different kinds of outcomes to occur. And that took us to a couple of statements. The statement is, how do you connect startups and grown-ups? And as we thought about it, we said, it's really the screw-ups of the grown-ups that create the opportunity for the startups. And for those of you that have tried to create a business, sometimes you're intimidated because you think, well, there's all these big companies out there, they could surely do what we're about to try to do. But it's usually their screw-ups that have opened up the opportunity for you to start your own venture to begin with. Now, that's a great feeling of comfort if you're an entrepreneur. The difficulty is the flip side of it. And that is, guess what? My startup's going to screw up a lot before we grow up.
Yeah, in fact, when we looked at the startup environment, at the entrepreneurial environment, we really said, more than any other environment, failure was the prerequisite for startups to exist, because these opportunities wouldn't even be there but for the fact that somebody didn't commercialize it or failed in a marketplace. And then we started looking at all of these startups, and we often hear the word pivot when we hear, okay, let's go out and try something. And if it doesn't work, we're going to iterate, and we're going to iterate, we're going to fail, we're going to fail, we're going to get those insights, and we're going to pivot. So we thought that we would illustrate that with one story. Now, I'm sure people here drink bourbon. Does anybody here use bourbon? It's a mobile app. No. So Bourbon is a mobile application that has raised money from Andreessen Horowitz and a number of other high-profile venture capitalists and angel investors. And it was a little bit of a mashup of Foursquare and some Zynga in there and some photo apps and a few other things. And there were a couple of really smart guys in the development team. They raised a bunch of capital. They created what they thought was the killer mobile app that was basically going to be your companion in all sorts of ways. You could check into locations, take photos, win points, play games, do all of this. And they took it out to their customers, and you know what their customers said? Sucks. It's too complicated. We don't understand how this works here or this works there. But we love this little photo application you have on the side with these cool little filters. It's kind of retro. So after a year's worth of work, these guys shelved all of the apps that they'd really focused on. They spent 2 months, and they focused on their photo app, and they launched Instagram. And we know what happened with Instagram. At the time, when Instagram was acquired, $1 billion seemed incredibly expensive for it by Facebook. But in retrospect, it was probably a great deal. Now, that was a great pivot. That was learning from your mistakes. But sometimes, when you fail, you don't necessarily want to pivot or pivot too quickly. So, has anybody used WD-39? That would be water displacement formula 39. And there was a WD-1 and a WD-2 and a WD-3. And none of those quite worked. But fortunately, these guys learned from every one of their failures, and they said, we're going in the right direction. And eventually, of course, they came up with WD-40, which has remained unchanged, John, for how many years now?
More than 40.
More than 40 years. Bada boom. This is the first example, when we start talking about learning from our failures, that really led us to understand that there were these patterns. And they were different patterns that we saw across startups, keep-ups, and grown-ups. But there were some consistent patterns as well. John, will you share what we found?
So, as Mark was describing WD-40, you know, everybody knows the lingo of pivots and lean startup and that sort of thing, which is really terrific. But the counterpoint to the pivot that we saw in bourbon turning into Instagram is the rivet that we saw here with WD-39 through 40, because sometimes that is what it takes. It just takes tenacity. It takes the ability to leverage the failures that you have and keep doing what you're trying to do originally. You just need a little bit more time, maybe a little bit more perseverance to do it. So the cycle that we tried to identify is something that we hoped our readers would understand, might actually even recall and remember, which is something we nicknamed the failure value cycle.
Actually, this is the first time the failure value cycle has been publicly shared.
I guess that's right. And with apologies to any pirates in the audience, we decided to call every one of these stages with an R, all right? Because, you know, and believe me, we looked at every other combination, 2x2s and pyramids and pentagons and all kinds of things. But we ultimately decided that what we wanted is something that captured the full life cycle of the failure experience, number one. And we wanted to put it in terms that an executive, an entrepreneur, a team member, regardless of the age of the organization, could begin to apply and think about. And in fact, there's a companion report card that we've actually developed on a prototype basis in the book. But let me, if you'll indulge me with the R's, right? You see the before, during, and after. It starts with, oh, by the way, why was it we were listening to Aretha Franklin when we came in here? It starts with R-E-S-P-E-C-T. It starts with recognizing and respecting, really, respecting the inevitability, the universality, the fallibility that failure represents. Because if you do not start with respecting failure to begin with, if your attitude is it's never going to happen, that failure is not an option, you're in for some very, very major lessons. So it starts, it's grounded, if you will, with respect. Now, second is the issue of rehearse. Some of you may be familiar with a term called high reliability organizations. It was actually developed here at Berkeley many years ago. What's an example of a high reliability organization? Hopefully, a nuclear power plant, a surgical suite, right? A place where life and death decisions are made, where there has to be redundancy in procedures, where people need to know how to backfill if somebody's sick or there's a natural disaster. Those are high reliability organizations. Startups, in some way, are high resiliency organizations. They need to be bred, they need to think about how they can bob and weave and improvise around the inevitable uncertainties that they're trying to basically make sense out of in order to bring a new product or service to market. So the issue of how do you rehearse for failure? How do you think about it? How do you build in the capacity to anticipate, plan on how you might respond to it, and build that kind of muscle memory around failure in advance of it actually occurring? Lots of other professions do this extraordinarily well. Business doesn't do a very good job of this. Business does a fine job of doing fire drills and earthquake disasters and maybe even terrorist preparation, but we don't do a very good job of actually preparing our organizations and our teams for the much more likely array of failures that are behind those statistics that Mark shared with us early on. 95% of new products, most mergers and acquisitions, 80% of new hires fail, et cetera, et cetera. We almost seem to be better at creating failure sometimes than we do creating and sustaining success. So where does that take us? It takes us to early recognition of failure. How do you extend the perimeter? How do you anticipate where failure might occur on the perimeter of your business and beyond the perimeter of your business so that you can buy time to react to it more appropriately? And those all happen beforehand. Now, in the middle of a failure situation, it's how do you react? And we'll give you some examples of positives and negatives of how organizations have dealt with failure in the moment. Obviously, you can begin to see some connection here to the degree to which you've rehearsed. Maybe your reaction is going to be a little faster, a little bit more appropriate, and conversely. Now, what happens afterwards? First, it's about reflection. It's about deep, honest, candid attempts to understand not necessarily initially who was involved. In fact, one of the people that we interviewed, I mentioned to you earlier, Chad Holliday, who's the chairman of the board of Royal Dutch Shell, and before that was CEO of DuPont. Chad talked to us and said, you know, one of the first reactions that a lot of times you see in business, particularly large publicly held businesses, is when something goes wrong, the first question they ask is, who are we going to fire? Who do we have to fire? And he said, basically, that has it completely upside down. What we really need to think about is the sequence of questions. Why did this happen? What happened? Where did it happen? How did it happen? And if we can begin to understand that, asking who was involved may be far less important and may be far less of a contributing factor to what actually did occur. So there's an issue of reflection. Then it has to do with, okay, you don't want to wallow in failure, so what do you do next? You got to get back in the game. You've got to rebound in some ways. And we'll give you a couple examples, both good and bad, of how companies have handled that particular stage of this failure value cycle. And then lastly, as we almost stopped there, and we said, well, that would be a nice model. We'd have a hexagon, and we could think about putting it together like a beehive, and you know, it'd be very interesting. And then we said, no, wait. The more people talked to us, they said, what's really important as a capstone to understanding how to leverage and put failure to work is how to inject the memory of how we did it before into our culture. That we didn't walk away from it, that we didn't ignore it, that we didn't rationalize it. We dealt with it, we learned from it, we applied it, and that's part of who we are. I mean, the paradigmatic example of that, of course, would be something like how Johnson & Johnson handled Tylenol, for those of you that may be familiar with that. That's a story that is still resonant in today's Johnson & Johnson culture. So you put those all together and you begin to say, okay, there are 7 stages in which an organization, whether it's a startup, a keep-up, or a grown-up, can begin to think about understanding how well prepared it is, what its attitudes are about this other F word, and what it can do about it. So let's hear about some examples.
So one of the things that's particularly interesting when we take a look at this is the cyclical nature of it. And we're going to start with respect. And as we go through this, we'll give you some specific examples. What we loved about having this framework and then having all these wonderful stories and interactions is it provides a canvas for us to kind of hang some of these stories on as well. But when you start with respect, you realize that the reason that typically companies and cultures will respect failure is because they've been through this, and that culture is one that also remembers the learnings from prior failures. So one of the companies that we'll start with that does a phenomenal job respecting culture, respecting failure, is Google. And if you think about Google, they are ruthless in sunsetting products that don't meet their expectations. They are metrics driven. If products aren't growing the way they want to, for example, they had one of the first social networks before Facebook was ever out. It's called Orkut, and it was the largest social network in a number of areas of the world, not the US. For example, Brazil, it was the largest social network. They shut it down 3 or 4 months ago once Facebook passed it. The Google Reader. We saw recently what happened with Google Glass. And the reason that they do that, and the reason that their employees are okay with that, is their employees know that the success or failure of a project is not necessarily pinned to the individuals involved, but rather what they do is they say, what are the learnings? Just exactly what John was saying. How do we separate some of the insights that we have, the what and the why, from the who? Google does that phenomenally well. And we heard that from across the organization. The second stage that we want to talk about is rehearse. And if you think about high reliability organizations, some of the ones that John mentioned, we also spoke, for example, with Mark Larrett, who's the CEO at UCSF Hospital, which just transitioned from their old campus to the new one just about a week ago. And what was fascinating is they did it on Super Bowl Sunday. And I was speaking with him and I said, aren't you doing this slowly? He said, no, we can't actually run 2 hospitals with 1 staff. So we have to shut one hospital down and move everybody, all of our patients across at once, and we have to do that seamlessly. And they had hundreds of ambulances lined up at the old campus to do that. And what he said was great. He says, you know, failure doesn't happen on your timetable. And for that reason, they constantly run drills to rehearse for whatever types of failures, natural disasters or whatever may happen. But part of what you have to think about, whatever type of organization you are, and we're going to use an example from this week, is what are your crown jewels? What do your stakeholders care the most about? And it's different for different types of organizations. In some cases, it's reliability. In some cases, it may be customer information. If we think about what happened with Brian Williams this week, what was his crown jewel? What is the crown jewel of a newscaster or a news organization? Integrity. So when this happened, we went back and took a look and said, what kind of advertising were they running before this happened? Let's take a look.
It's a thing that you build slowly, over time. And what you build, if you work hard enough, if you respect it, is a powerful thing called trust.
He's been there, he'll be there. Well, he won't be there for 6 months. And we'll see if 6 months is enough to regain that trust. But that's for the entire organization. He was just the figurehead of that. So these are elements when we talk about rehearsing. You say, let's make sure that we rehearse around those items and we don't allow failure to happen on those most critical elements. And one of the ways that we look to avoid having failure happen is to recognize it as early as possible. Oh, I'm going to talk about this one. So there's a lot of ways to recognize it early. You want to create your early warning systems. WeHeartIt is a social network out of San Francisco that is kind of a Pinterest type of social network for younger adults. And what was fascinating for them, they were growing incredibly quickly, adding 1 million users a month. And all of a sudden, they started noticing that their growth was tailing off and that they had unwelcome users on their system. And they weren't sure how to be able to combat that. And they couldn't understand how to recognize where it was coming from. So they turned to a big data outfit out of UC Berkeley called Wise.io. And Wise.io started using big data to understand the patterns of what these hackers were doing. And they were setting up automated bots that would basically hijack the web traffic. But by putting in place this layer of intelligence of big data, what WeHeartIt was able to do was to start to recognize these attacks earlier, stop those attacks, and then shut those off. Now the fascinating thing is once they started getting into understanding the power of big data for this, they started turning it around and saying, how can we then better use it to understand what our most profitable customers are? And they turned it from a defensive tool into an offensive tool. So the key thing is, how do you recognize failure earlier, and then what do you do about it?
And in effect, what We Heart It was able to do is to expand the perimeter of their business. In this case, through the use of big data and big data techniques, actually contributed by somebody who teaches here, Chuck Teller. So that takes us through respect, through rehearse, through recognize. At some point, you got to do something when it happens. And we were trying to figure out examples of both how people have done this well and how people have not done it quite so well. In fact, as we've said, many organizations are better at flunking failure than they are at passing what we're talking about in terms of this failure value cycle. And we really couldn't come up with a positive example nearly as good as the negative one we're going to show you. And the reason for that is we wanted to make sure that our framework could really kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, get to the bottom of what happens here with React. And there's no real better example than what happened at Lululemon.
So do you want to set that up a little bit, or should I set it up for a moment?
Go ahead.
So people remember what happened with Lululemon, right? They had their yoga pants, which were $100 a pair, were just a little bit too sheer. So they went through that crisis and they came out with new yoga pants, which it turned out had problems pilling and wearing prematurely.
So obviously this is a crisis. It got a lot of negative attention. And who do you put into a situation of a crisis? You try to put your CEO, because surely that person knows how to react in the moment to this potentially existential threat because of the imperfect yoga pants that his company was responsible for producing. So this is his first response.
Some women's bodies just actually don't work for it.
The company's founder, Chip Wilson, appearing to suggest it's his customers who are the problem.
You know, really about the rubbing through the thighs.
And now, 1 week and plenty of outrage later, a very necessary apology posted online.
I'm sad. I'm really sad.
Off to a good start, right? Let's hear some more.
I'm sad for the people of Lululemon who I care so much about that have really had to face the brunt of my actions.
So here you have Mr. Wilson, who, reacts in the moment, clearly recognized he'd made a mistake, comes back and tries to make amends with his apology to his own people as opposed to his customers. And it wasn't so long before the inevitable happened. And that was just this week.
So that gets us to reflect. So once you have reacted in the moment, what do you do about it? When you do react, now Chip Wilson didn't do a very good job of it, but when you react, you want to buy time. You want to let your customers and key stakeholders know they matter to you. You want to ask for enough time to be able to resolve the situation and maybe call upon some of the goodwill you've built up over the years as well. But once that does happen, how do you take advantage of it to then reflect, create that strategy, and then rebound? So one of the companies that we found that did a really great job at reflecting was Twitter. Twitter has gone through a long time trying to figure out a business model that works. And when we spoke with Michael Sippy, who was one of the speakers here as well a while back, and he headed products for Twitter. When we spoke with him about the way they think about product and product iteration, what he said was they have meetings on a regular basis that are perhaps the most enlightening meetings he's ever had. And people that are out doing projects or conducting research come in and they say, here are the results of our project. But rather than treating the results or the reports as successes or failures of business projects, they treat them as a kind of a deconstruction of results. They use the language of science much more, experimentation, negative outcomes and positive outcomes. What kind of metrics did we have that were positive and negative? And they incorporate that in the way that they iterate around products.
One of the things that we were struck by as we talked to companies up and down the life cycle is everybody will acknowledge that in order to innovate, you need to have some kind of trial and error. The difficulty is that in many cultures that becomes trial and terror. That people are simply afraid to take the next step to try something different. And it's one of the reasons why starting the conversation around failure becomes so important as a first step to begin to come to terms with the potential of the other F word to drive innovation, employee engagement, and growth.
Yeah, well, and that's where the implications of what happens to people if they're associated with projects that fail. Do they get fired? Do they get ostracized? Do they get put on all the unfun projects? If they don't, as we saw with Google and Twitter, then you have an environment where people are not afraid to take risks, they're not afraid to innovate, and as a result, you get that risk-taking and innovation, you get that collaboration, and you get your best people willing to take those risks because they know that if it doesn't work out, their jobs are not necessarily in peril.
So there must be a better example than Lululemon. Can't we give them something positive here?
So let's take a look at another disaster, shall we? So remember when Netflix introduced Quickster? How many people remember Quickster? Quickster was about 3 years ago, maybe a little more, and Netflix, in its infinite wisdom, said, well, we send you DVDs and we've been doing some streaming. We're going to split the company in half. We're going to name them 2 different things, and we're going to charge you for each one. So the customers actually didn't react really well to that, as you might not be surprised. And as a result, within 2 months, Netflix was losing 1 million customers a month. 75% of its market cap. Everybody assumed they were no longer going to be an independent public company. They were calling for the CEO's head. Shareholder lawsuits were happening. This was not a good situation. Here's what Reed Hastings did, who was the CEO in a similar situation as Chip Wilson.
Hi, I'm Reed Hastings, CEO and co-founder of Netflix.
I'm Andy Rendich, and I head up DVD operations at Netflix.
We've been working for the past 14 years to build Netflix year by year into the best possible service we could build. And we're making this video today to apologize in person, or at least on camera, for something that we did recently.
And he actually went on to apologize, as opposed to blame his customers. And he said, we're going to fix this. And they did. They rolled back Quickster. They actually looked at what was going on. They took that as an opportunity as well to look at what was going on with handheld devices and mobile devices. And they started creating original content like House of Cards and other things like that. And it took them 2 years. They recovered all of their share price. They passed HBO as the largest independent provider of content. And they continue to do exceptionally well. So that was an example of a great reflection. And then
So one of the things that we did in pulling this book together is we sent out invitations to people we did not know at all. And you want a lot of important people, you want some famous people, but most of all you want people who have stories to tell, who have stories to share. And one of the things that we started with was a simple email that went out to hundreds of CEOs of companies all over the world. And we thought, well, you know, we teach entrepreneurship, we teach innovation. You got to be prepared to take some risks. So we said, what do we have to lose here? Let's just send it out, tell people what we're doing. Within 10 minutes, we started to get responses from CEOs of major companies around the world, including not within 10 minutes, but within a day, including the person who wrote the foreword to our book, Jeff Bewkes, who's the chairman and CEO of Time Warner. But one of the people that sent us back a note was the person who works for the CEO of a company that you probably have never heard of, called Henry Schein and Company. Henry Schein turns out to be a major player worldwide in dental and medical supplies. It's a company based in Long Island. It started off in a little drugstore 2 generations ago. And Stan Bergman, who's the CEO, has been with the company now for close to 40 years. And I visited Stan in New York in his apartment, beautiful apartment right below Derek Jeter's apartment, it turned out. And we started talking about failure. And we started talking about why would you want to talk about failure in your organization with a Berkeley faculty person. And he said, you know, what's really important to us as a culture is not trying to avoid failure in the first place, because we know we can't do that. It's really how we respond to failure when it happens that begins to distinguish our culture. It begins to give our people a sense of resilience. And I said, well, can you give me an example? And he said, yeah, I'll give you one that I was personally involved with. Here's a company that ships all over the world, thousands and thousands of times. They had decided to embark on one of those fabulous IT projects that Mark talked about earlier, 68% of which fail, right? So he hadn't gotten that memo, maybe. But the company decided they're going to embark on a brand new system. And they were excited about it, and they talked about what it was going to do to revolutionize the business and the like. And then it came time to turn on the new system. And they realized that none, really almost none of the records, the core records that had been kept for decades in this company, were capable of being transported into this new system. And it almost shut the company down. In the book we talked about, imagine having a root canal. As bad as that is, imagine doing one on yourself. And that's kind of what this company had to do. Stan stopped the company, brought everybody in, and they worked nonstop for weeks, literally going through company by company, customer by customer records to try to get this system back up and operating. And they did. And that was 20 years ago. That company still to this day recalls who was involved, what it felt like, what kind of support they had from one another, how they were able to survive that mortal threat to their reputation, to the company itself. And that's a great example to us of this seventh and final stage of this failure value cycle, which is remember. Remember. Because if all you're doing is reacting in the moment, if all you're doing is thinking about failure as a single isolated event, rather than as potentially this rich resource that has the ability to teach you what you don't know, to show you what the outer edges of your own assumptions, or in some cases your own humility, really are, you've wasted the one resource that we all create virtually every day. So Henry Schein we thought was a great way to close this particular cycle. But there's one story, current story, that we think goes through that entire cycle that you will be familiar with.
Yeah, and this is one where they flunked failure. So here's our failure value cycle. Respect, failure, rehearse, especially around those crown jewels, to be ready for it when it happens, and then recognize it as early as you can. Put in place those early warning systems where you can, so that you can recognize it earlier, you can mitigate its impact, and then when it does happen, react as effectively as possible to buy that time, to limit the losses, reflect upon those learnings, make sure you draw those right insights out, focus more on the what and the why and the how as opposed to the who. There may be who, but focus on those other elements first. And then, once you've done those, launch into that rebound. Build the plans around everything that you've learned, and then finally be sure to remember it. And we want to talk a little bit more about remember in just a moment. But before that, we wanted to touch on an example of a company that's actually had several failures recently. The one that really drew our attention early was the big data breach. As we all remember, a little over a year ago, holiday, when Target had more than 100 million customer records hacked. And we went back and we said, what were their crown jewels? And the crown jewels of a retailer like Target is its customer information and the trust that its customers place in it. And it immediately, and of course with that, it lost that. And we've seen what's happened to sales, and we've seen what's happened to market cap. Now, they've stumbled again in other ways. They just announced they were withdrawing from Canada just this week as well. So Target is one of those companies that does not seem to be failure savvy, which is one of the terms that we bring forth in the book, the ability to deal with failure in a positive and productive way. Some more insights for Target? Or
well, you know, Target is this continuing train wreck around that particular episode. Every one of those 7 stages, they basically blew. Hopefully they learned from it. We signaled a few other companies that have subsequently had the same problem: Apple, American Express, Home Depot. Home Depot's CEO was one of those people that responded to us in our email request and handled their particular situation quite differently, much more constructively and powerfully than did his counterpart at Target. So we started this out with a discussion about this other F word. And we suggested that in most organizations, it ends up being thought of, dealt with, or not dealt with, and not talked about, because fundamentally it's being treated as a taboo. So we wanted to end by suggesting really to you, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're managing a small or medium-sized business, whether or not you're working in a large business, or whether or not you will be at some point in your career, We wanted to boil down maybe 4 very, very simple, specific things that you could begin to do if you're interested in changing your relationship with this failure topic. We had some help. We had some help from this organization, Great Place to Work Institute. These are the folks behind the Fortune magazine 100 Best Places to Work. They've done these interviews now for 18 years, in the millions of interviews. They know a fair amount about what it takes to create a great place to work for startups, for small, medium, and large companies, including government agencies, it turns out, as well. China Gorman was one of the people that we talked with. She's the CEO. She was kind enough to write the afterword to our book. But she also shared with us some of the insights that they had picked up through their extensive research into this topic. If you want the Cliff's Notes version of what their insight is, trust. Trust. You want to create a great place to work? It's trust. How do you do that? We think there are basically 4 things. First, it's the vocabulary that you use. Can you talk about failure? Can you discuss it in a way that perhaps is more like experiment rather than failure? Think about how we talk in business about strategies, projects, transactions. Think about how your attitude of failure is immediately set up because of those words. Now change it and say experiment. The minute you change that vocabulary, you begin to think, oh, experiments more often fail than don't, right? We kind of expect failure to go along with experiments. Well, what are new products, new projects, new strategies, mergers and acquisitions, other than experiments? They all are acts of leadership and assertion into the face of uncertainty, and they're probably likely to not fare quite as well as we would hope. So it starts with the vocabulary, starts with beginning the conversation that you can have with your people to make it possible for them to talk about and acknowledge not just their failures, but for you to acknowledge your own. We had several people talk to us about the importance of confident humility in starting this conversation. One of them was a guy named Chris Michael, who's the founder of Affinity Labs. For those of you that have read a book called The Intelligent Entrepreneur, he was one of the 3 people mentioned in that book. And Chris talks about how in every business that he has started or he is now on the board of, he wants to make sure that people know how he has screwed up. Because he figures if people know that he's okay with talking about how he screwed up, they may be more open to share ideas and experiences and insights that they've had along the way. So that's the start. Second, the questions you ask. We've talked about this. The sequence is important. Postpone acting on the who, asking about the who. Yeah, you're going to find out who was involved. Believe me, the teams are very conscious of who's involved in a failure environment. But start with why, what, how, where. Ask it again. And before you start looking to point fingers, put a mirror in front of yourself. Because chances are, if you're responsible for an organization, you probably have your fingerprints on that scenario that you're so concerned about understanding. Stories.
Well, we've shared some stories, a number of stories today. And if you think about some of the stories where companies responded well, where leaders responded well, are those the kinds of teams you want to be a part of? And it's around creating those stories, because stories outlive executives. Stories, John mentioned the Tylenol example, for example, or Henry Schein. Those stories are 20, 30, 40 years old, yet the power of those stories is incredibly deep. So putting those stories in place and making them a part of the culture, incredibly important. And then finally, relics. Imagine if you walked in to the headquarters where WD-40 is made, and you saw a cabinet that had WD-1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through. You would know that that was a company that valued experimentation and persevered through failure.
Or New Coke, if you visited Atlanta.
One of the examples that we love to cite is if you go to Bessemer Venture Partners, and we cite this in our book, they have an anti-portfolio. How they passed on Google, and the Google story is great. They said, the partner said, Dave Cowan said, how can I get out of this house? He was visiting the house in which the Google founders, Larry and Sergey, were working in the garage. And he asked the owner, how can I get out of this house without going anywhere near the garage? She was trying to get them to invest. FedEx, what are some of the other ones?
Intel,
yeah.
PayPal. They turned
eBay.
down FedEx 7 times.
Yeah. So, and they put that up on their website. So the power of stories and relics certainly exists there. So that was our fourth one, relics. So look for those things to start to create that culture. John, last word.
So we've heard a lot of adages about failure, and we decided we needed to have one ourselves. So this is one we created. Failure's today's lessons for tomorrow. We think that kind of captures what we're really talking about. It gets the power of failure. Failure is going to teach you what you don't know. It's going to flag for you the weakness of your hubris, the confidence of your assumptions, and it's ultimately going to help you potentially, if you're open and honest enough to deal with it, it potentially will unleash the power of your organization to get more innovation, to be more creative, to grow, and ultimately to get the kind of employee engagement, genuine employee engagement, that is the secret to really great sustaining organizations. So thanks. We appreciate the opportunity to share some of our thinking with you about this new book. Oh, what are we going to do?
We also learned that you have to be willing to ask and put yourself
really?
out there. Yes, you do. That's part of this. So,
all right.
if you're interested in this, before the book comes out, we have some excerpts that we'll have in the next week or so that we can share. Just go to the website, theotherfwordbook.com, give us your email, and we'll go ahead and send what the publisher allows us to send you.
And you can pre-order it now from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, 800 CEO, Read, and the like. Yeah. Let's see. We've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. If you'd like to challenge us or have a question, go ahead. We need a microphone. If you can come up or pass this one back here.
And John, while we're at it, for the first question, do you have something?
Yeah, you know, it's rare. We have 3 of these certificates. On the back of it, it says, "This entitles you to a complimentary copy of The Other F Word."
Thank you.
If you enjoy it, tell your friends. If you don't, tell us.
Yeah.
John and Mark. So we've got 2 more of these.
All right. Thanks for the great talk, and I really appreciate that. So I have a question. So let's say I'm doing a tech startup. How do I do the rehearsal step? Let's say, for instance, what I'm doing right now is you want to commercialize the technology that I developed during my PhD study, and all you have, the only resource we have only allows you to build a product, talk to customer, and do some modification of the product. But if we concentrate too much on the what if scenarios, let's say what if there's a data leaks someday in the future, or what if somebody hack our system and then stole our idea, then we're jeopardized. We can't move along. So I just want to ask, how do you deal with the rehearse step when you're in a startup?
One of the things that we suggest in the book is an exercise that we call "What Has to Be True," and it's a great exercise in a startup in particular, because in the startup you're surrounded by all these unknowns, right? You got questions that are coming from customers about your tech folks, your financial people, your organization you don't have gelled yet. So we wanted to come up with an exercise that basically says, how can you help your team align and focus around the fundamental things that have to be true for your business vision to make sense and to be successful? So part of this is the question of focus, and I mean real focus. We have several folks from one of our classes, they're going through this exercise now to try to identify, let's say in customers, what's the one thing that has to be true about your customers in order for your business to be successful? What's the one thing about your technology that has to work, that has to be better than the status quo? What's that? Because if you can keep your focus on that and then do one other thing, and that is try to keep some resources available, because the worst mistake of all, the worst failure of all, is running out of resources before you have the opportunity to apply the lesson of the previous failure. So my first answer to you would be very tight alignment and agreement by your team about what exactly your agenda is, whether that's an engineering agenda or a marketing agenda or a finance agenda, I don't know. But that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think that's right. Ask your team members to do that same exercise and see if you get that alignment. That's a way to actually start to bring that alignment together, then go test like crazy. So later on, you're going to be rehearsing against failures. Right now, you're actually looking for failures, because failures will give you that data to be more successful.
Microphone in the back. Where? Right here. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi. So when you interviewed all these CEOs and they were talking to you about being vulnerable and being able to look at their own failures and whatnot, did you look at the emotional quotients or emotional intelligence quotient of these people, and do they have enough conscious awareness of themselves to be able to actually be vulnerable, be able to talk about this, and create that culture as, you know, in terms of being the leader in the organization? Did you look at that element?
It's an important question, and it's one that we talked about but did not go in with any instrument to measure it, if you will. What we were looking for were the signs of candor, frankly, and acknowledgement. Because these folks did not have to talk to us at all. I mean, in some ways, what they're talking about are things that they ordinarily wouldn't talk about.
But what was fascinating is the people that were the most willing to talk about their failures were those that had been successful in spite of or because of their failures. So people that, you know, were not so successful in general were far less willing to open up about things that didn't work and what they learned from them.
I mean, just to give you an example of somebody else that went through both experiences, was Julie Wainwright, who was the CEO of Pets.com. That's the poster child of the .bomb implosion. And she talked with us at some length about what that experience was like, what she took away from it, and now how she's applied some of those insights into her current venture called The Real Real, which is a quite different but very interesting and we think kind of high potential opportunity.
And quite successful right now, on its way through $200 million in revenues and growing.
Do we
do.
All right.
Last question, as we keep you not too late.
In the back here.
All right. Here.
I thought it was really interesting and makes sense about how important it is for trust with employees not to have a knee-jerk reaction in terms of just, you know, having heads roll, so to speak, and firing people. And I understand why that would be difficult in publicly traded companies where that seems to be the norm with activist investors and people that want to see that happen. But I'm also wondering if the flip side of that is if you don't hold people accountable, that might encourage sort of innovation without discipline, or encourage people to maybe basically be too risky. And I'm just wondering if you guys studied that, or if you...
Let me take that. That's a great observation, one we didn't touch on here, but it's one that we spend a lot of time on in the book as well. So there are a lot of places where you can't fail. I mean, we talk about things like, you know, high reliability organizations, nuclear submarines, power plants, drug companies, where you have to be incredibly careful. Also, if failures happen as a result of, you know, negligence or incompetence or whatever, those are situations that have to be addressed. But when you get outside of actually there's one more thing to add to it. A healthy kind of fear of failure, knowing that there are some repercussions, is one of those things that also helps drive entrepreneurs. So if you can always fail, then you don't have, without repercussion, then there's not that same discipline and drive to succeed. So we know that there are repercussions for failing. And healthy organizations really use that in a way where they say, we have zones where you can't fail, and then where we're trying to innovate and grow, we have zones where we're going to encourage innovation, where we're going to encourage risk-taking, and it's okay to fail. And the repercussions are fundamentally different across them. John?
No. Thanks very much, folks. Appreciate sharing the evening.